Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn d7 to d6. Pawn d2 to d4. Knight b8 to d7. Bishop f1 to c4. Pawn c7 to c6. Castle kingside. Pawn b7 to b5. Bishop c1 to g5. Queen d8 to a5. Queen d1 to e1. Queen a5 takes e1. Bishop c4 takes f7, check. King e8 takes f7. Knight f3 takes e1. Pawn e5 takes d4. Pawn c2 to c3. Pawn h7 to h6. Bishop g5 to f4. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn f2 to f3. Knight f6 to h5. Bishop f4 to d2. Pawn c6 to c5. Knight e1 to d3. Pawn c5 to c4. Knight d3 to f4. Knight h5 takes f4. Bishop d2 takes f4. Pawn g7 to g5. Bishop f4 takes d6. Bishop f8 takes d6. Pawn c3 takes d4. King f7 to e8. Pawn b2 to b3. Bishop c8 to b7. Pawn h2 to h4. Pawn g5 to g4. Pawn b3 takes c4. Pawn b5 takes c4. Pawn d4 to d5. Bishop d6 to e5. Knight b1 to a3. Bishop e5 takes a1. Rook f1 takes a1. Knight d7 to f6. Knight a3 takes c4. Rook a8 to c8. Knight c4 to d6, check. King e8 to d8. Knight d6 takes b7, check. King d8 to e8. Knight b7 to d6, check. King e8 to d7. Knight d6 takes c8. Rook h8 takes c8. King g1 to f2. Rook c8 to c2, check. King f2 to f1. King d7 to d6. Pawn a2 to a4. King d6 to e5. Rook a1 to b1. Pawn a7 to a5. Rook b1 to b7. Rook c2 to a2. Rook b7 to e7, check. King e5 to d6. Rook e7 to e6, check. King d6 to c5. Rook e6 takes f6. Rook a2 to a1, check. King f1 to e2. Rook a1 to a2, check. King e2 to d3. Rook a2 to a3, check. King d3 to c2. Rook a3 to a2, check. King c2 to c3. Rook a2 to a3, check. King c3 to b2. Rook a3 takes a4. Rook f6 takes h6. Rook a4 to b4, check. King b2 to c3. Rook b4 to c4, check. King c3 to d3. Rook c4 to d4, check. King d3 to e2. Rook d4 takes d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Pawn g4 takes f3, check. King e2 takes f3. King c5 takes d5. Rook h6 to h5, check. King d5 to d4. Rook h5 takes a5. King d4 to c4. Pawn h4 to h5. King c4 to d4. Pawn g2 to g4. King d4 to c4. Pawn g4 to g5. King c4 to d4. Pawn g5 to g6. King d4 to c3. Pawn h5 to h6. King c3 to b4. Rook a5 to a7. King b4 to c3. Pawn g6 to g7. King c3 to d4. Pawn h6 to h7. King d4 to d5. King f3 to e3. King d5 to a6. King e3 to d4. King e6 to f6. King d4 to d5. King f6 to g6. Pawn g7 to g8, promoting to queen, check. King g6 to f6. Rook a7 to f7, checkmate.